Hello, everyone. We're getting organized. We will be with you in just a couple seconds.
I look so young in that photo.
I did some digging from Leadership Boise.
It's nice. Thank you.
Figure that's one less thing that we have to bug you about.
Yeah,
If we can just
made
go
my
back.
day.
Yep, grab that.
I need to work out or something today. How's everybody doing?
Good. Just waiting on. We've got about maybe 27 people now registered.
Okay.
So letting the numbers climb here. We're at 12, 13. Well, minus 4, I guess, because of us.
Hey, Alex.
Hey, Angela. How are you?
Doing well, thanks.
Yeah. I know it's not been too long since we last talked.
Exactly. But it's all running together these days. Melissa, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Angela?
Doing well. Doing well.
Good.
Good. Seeing you in
Happy
office.
Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday.
What's that?
Seeing you in office.
Yes.
Good.
Yes. Yes.
Good. Good.
Yeah. Are you still, you're at home still?
Yep. Yep.
Good. Very good.
For the indefinite future.
Yeah.
It's so much easier. Alex, I don't know if you have the same experience, but like, especially now, like it feels like I've had 2 workshops. This is my 3rd workshop today. So it's so nice to not have to go to another building and set up your laptop and get everything set up, is to be on Zoom and to go from one to the next.
I feel like I need to sometimes like fake my commute though, so I can actually tap out of work when I'm done for the day. I can easily just bleed into the rest of my day with like not switching gears. So
That's a good point. Sure.
I love that.
All right. 15, we'll get started at 12:05 with our presentation, and then hopefully that gives everybody enough time to continue joining while we're going through our spiel that they've probably heard before. This felt like a very long minute for some reason, maybe because we're all extra quiet. All right.
Tell us some jokes, Maddie, while we're waiting.
Nope, like it's your time to go, 12:05.
Oh,
Look at that timing.
sounds good. Well, welcome everybody. We're excited to have you guys here for October Lunch and Learn. And excited to have Alex and Angela here with us. Are you flipping the pages, Maddie?
I am. It's just not letting me for some reason.
That's okay.
Let's see. I'll just have to use the actual buttons.
Hidden?
Yep.
A big thanks to our 2020 program sponsors, Albertsons, Boise State Alumni Association, Balsam Brands, Idaho Central Credit Union, Micron, and the Idaho Statesman. And a thanks as well to our corporate sponsors. Each of these companies pay for all of their employees to have membership with BYP. So really great that they have committed to the growth and development of their employees and also of Boise. So we do have some upcoming events. Obviously, most of them are on Zoom. One, though, that I would love to point out is the Professional Development Day, which is on November 10th. This is a totally virtual event. And right now, the cost is only $35, which is pretty phenomenal because I think normally it's over $100 to attend this. So great value. So make sure you guys register for that. And you can register by just going to the BYP website, the boiseyp.org, and sign up there. And a special thanks to all of our work team members. Each of the organizations that we have are all volunteer ran. And so without our volunteers, we would not be able to put on the events that we do. So big thank you to each of them. And so with that, we'll just turn it over to Alex and Angela. Alex is the Senior Diversity and Equality and Inclusion Consultant and Strategist. And Angela is the President and CEO of AFT 22 Enterprises, and also owns several for-profit and nonprofit organizations. So thanks you guys for being here, and look forward to what you guys have to share with us.
Great. Thanks, Melissa and Maddie. It's exciting to be here. And thanks for those of you that are able to carve out time for this Lunch and Learn. Was thrilled a few months ago when I spoke with Melissa and she asked if Alex and I could have this conversation with you around diversity, equity, inclusion. And I was excited about it for a myriad of different reasons. Partly because I think that there's a unique new visibility into the impact and the importance of equity, inclusion in particular, and certainly diversity, coming out of the heels of COVID-19, right? I think COVID-19 for so many of us isolated some things that maybe we hadn't been aware of before. And one of those main things was the fact that there's a lot of inequities in the systems, whether it's around race, socioeconomic status, educational attainment, access to healthcare, so many things. And so I think that this is a really timely discussion and important conversation to have with you, the leaders, current leaders and future leaders of this community. For Alex and I, who have roots here in Idaho, and we'll share a little bit about our stories later, incredibly important to be part of a community that is having these discussions and helping leaders, not just be leaders, but be audacious leaders. And so that's what we're hoping to talk to you about a little bit today. I'm going to share my desktop with you here quickly. Hopefully, can everybody see that on the screen? Thumbs up, Alex. Awesome. So today we're going to do two things. So the first hour for the Lunch and Learn, we're going to do a little bit of an Ask Me Anything session, which is something that both of us have been doing quite a bit in these moments where we're just doing a virtual conversation inside of different organizations and companies where employees are curious and asking a lot of questions about what's happening in this moment, particularly around social justice. And so in this session, we are going to kind of do some quick session overview. We'll do a presentation and discussion of diversity, equity, inclusion language, the fundamentals, the dynamics, and the language that are being used, which is completely different today than it was 3 or 4 months ago, and is shifting on a regular basis. So we want to make sure that as leaders in this community, you have some foundational knowledge of what the language is, because I know in interactions I've had, there's some hesitation around using the language or knowing what to say, when to say it. And I think that hesitation actually leads to people opting out of the conversation and opting out of actually leading in this space. And so we want to make sure we close that gap. And we'll do that for about 35 minutes. Go through it really quickly. There's a litany of information available online, but we'll go through some of the terms that we think are really important for you to be aware of. And then we'll do an Ask Me Anything. Alex and I will share some questions that we're hearing a lot from clients and leaders such as yourselves. And then we'll open it up for you to ask us literally anything. We are happy to be here to answer those questions, those burning questions that you may have, that you're not sure who else that you can ask those to in a safe or pseudo safe space. And then we'll take a break. And for those of you that have to jump off, we'll wish you well. And we hope that many of you can stay with us for a workshop where we can kind of workshop this a little bit and get into conversation around it. And then we'll do a quick debrief and wrap up. So quick introduction. Again, as Melissa mentioned, I am a partner with the Dignitas agency. And my business partner, Stacy, is based out of the Bay Area, excuse me. We launched the Dignitas agency about 6 years ago. And we're really focused on leadership development and change. So we exist to do those two things, leadership development and change management. So in every conversation that we're having and during every project we're consulting on, we're focusing on how to shift limiting beliefs to breakthrough beliefs. And then the second thing is we also are looking at the broader context of where and how friction gets created inside of organizations and how you can actually minimize that through self-management so that people engage with that friction rather than run away from it. And what that does is create tighter loops in the process so that the work gets done more efficiently and with more efficacy. And that is how we look at equity inclusion, right? Equity inclusion is a huge challenge. It's a complex challenge for many who think it's a hard lift. It's not a hard lift, it's a complex lift with a lot of nuance. And what happens is that friction that shows up, those fears that we have as individual leaders, or the fear of the existential threats may keep us from moving forward and closing that gap. And so that's our focus in this work. And so we'll share kind of that perspective through this session. And we're happy to have someone that has done some amazing work in this space and who has some connection here in Boise in Alex Suggs. Before I mention that, I am born and raised in Mountain Home, so a Mountain Homian. And I'm really excited about the conversations that we're currently having here in the Treasure Valley. We have a number of companies that we're working with around equity, inclusion, strategy, and work. And we call Boise and Idaho our innovation hub. The conversations we're having here with leaders are so much different than the conversations we're having in the Bay Area with tech companies, and excited about what's around the corner for us, particularly as it pertains to equity and inclusion. And I know that's a thread that ties Alex and I to this work, particularly here in Idaho. So when I reached out to Alex and asked her to join me, was thrilled that she'd be part of this conversation. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Angela, and happy to be with all of you. I am now currently based out of DC, so it's great to kind of be back with my Boise family in a way. It's very different over here, and I always love coming home at the end of the day, just to really create the change needed on the ground in Idaho, right? And for me, I identify she, her, also as a queer individual, and so a lot of my work is informed both by my lived experience, but then also kind of my professional formal experience in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. From a lived experience perspective, growing up in Idaho, I had it pretty good in Boise, actually, in terms of being accepted and welcoming. But there were challenges finding other people like me, finding people in leadership that reflected my identity. And I really struggled with that growing up, of not kind of knowing where to turn and see myself. And it really led me to want to create workplaces and communities, environments where people don't come into a room and they're the only one, or they can see themselves reflected, they can see themselves fully embraced for their authentic selves. And so that's really kind of what motivates me to do the work that I do now. In the last 5 to 6 years or so, maybe even more at this point, I've maybe lost track, but I started this work doing diversity, equity, inclusion work with Boise State University, partnering with a few folks there at the College of Business and Economics while I was doing my MBA, and really got to get just kind of, I guess, just full all in this work, and it inspired me to really want to make a career out of it. at the time I didn't know there were companies dedicated to doing diversity, equity, inclusion work. I remember Googling it and being like, wait, there's consulting companies that do diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm like, sign me up. Like, I want to be a part of that. And so it brought me all the way to the East Coast in Boston, of all places, where I partnered with an organization for a few years, IBIS Consulting Group, and most recently was leading the racial equity program for Google. So working with organizations big and small, doing anything from strategic planning to having conversations like these to expand awareness and understanding and dialogue amongst employees, you name it. We're just trying to move the needle in any way possible. I'm now with Collective, new as in a month ago as a lead strategist. And so I'm excited to be joining you and continuing this work both at home and then kind of just all over the map in terms of the United States. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Alice. So excited to have this conversation and be in this conversation with you, with Alex. So we're just going to kind of very informally go back and forth as we cover some of the content that we will go over today. So why we're here mainly is we want to foster a deeper awareness of your individual point of view and begin to build a collective connection and sense of unity around this space and equity inclusion. And then the second thing is to kind of provide a foundational level of understanding of the current climate around equity, diversity, and inclusion. So those are the two primary things that we want to do. Before we get started, I would love to actually kind of poll the group and see why you're here today. Like, why, Alex and I are here. Maddie and Melissa kind of talked about why they are here a little bit in their connection to BYP and the great things that they're doing in leading that organization. I am curious as to why you are here and what is important to you about being in the room today. So I'm going to pull up here on your screen, hopefully in a second. We're going to use Slido. So there's a couple different ways to use Slido. If you want to pull out your phone, you can just scan using your camera app, scan the QR code, and it'll invite you to our events. Or you can, on your computer or phone, you can join us at slido.com and enter the event code BYP 2020. I'll give you a couple seconds to go ahead and do so. And while I'm doing that, just want to encourage, if you have any comments, questions throughout this process, please feel free to post them in the chat. If you aren't comfortable or you want it to be an anonymous question, you can message Maddie and she'll go ahead and read that anonymously to us as well. But again, this is what we say, not necessarily a safe space, but a space where it's safe to be uncomfortable. So we encourage you throughout the process to feel free to post any questions or thoughts or comments in the chat box. All right, so hopefully everyone has found their way over to Slido. And so the first thing is just, what is your why around diversity, equity, inclusion? So I'm going to share this with you, and hopefully you'll see it come up on your screen here in a moment. Okay, what is your why? Go ahead and type your responses. I'll give you about a minute. If you have multiple thoughts or responses, please feel free to post it in that box. But one of the things that's in this work that Alex and I do and the leaders that we work with, oftentimes most leaders are action oriented, right? You're trying to get results, you're trying to get right into action. But part of this work is not just the activity or the action, it's the somatic experience. It's like, what are you going through? What's on your mind? What are you feeling in your body? What's important to you, your why? And so we ask this question a lot to start to set that mindset of what is your why? Like, why are you doing this work? So hopefully, for those of you that have it, are you able to post? Is it accepting any submissions? Or perhaps people are like, I don't know why I'm in this space. Right, I had a lunch hour, I had a free hour to do something.
Typing, just slow.
Take your time, take your time. Thanks, Peaches. So daughter's Hispanic and want to feel included in the communities that she joins. Been passionate about DEI. Nice, created a DEI committee or council. Great. want to learn what you don't know in order to ensure that you uplift others. Love it. The political climate, we'll mention that, right? Like that comes up quite a bit. So we'll talk about the difference between politics with a capital P, which is partisanship, and then politics with a lowercase p, which we all are always engaged around policy and programming. A leader for 2 community organizations. Excellent. Well, great to have you in the space. Glad that you all kind of know why you're in this room. I'll leave that poll open so you can continue to go ahead and respond if you'd like. But it's really important for you, like as you start to absorb this content, to know why it's important to you, and what triggers may show up for you, where you may get triggered or fearful or all those things. Notice those as we have this conversation. If there's a word or phrase we use and it kind of you gasp or whatever, like note like what showed up for you, right? So we can start to unravel that a little bit and get to the root of it. And then that's where you can start to lead from strength and power in the process. All right, so a little bit of context setting. You know, prior to COVID-19 or coronavirus, and certainly prior to May 25th, I know from my perspective, had a completely different energy around equity, inclusion work, and diversity work. But since May 25th, it has changed a little bit for me, and I'll invite Alex in here in a moment to get her perspective around this too. But so May 25th was actually kind of when most of us started to hear about the George Floyd situation, like, right, and his killing. And in May 25th, all of a sudden, for those of us that are doing this work, our inboxes, our phones, our emails, like just were blown up because people were like, wait a minute, something is different in this moment. And what shifted in that moment was we went from the business case for diversity, equity, inclusion to humanity, right? I think in that moment, from Amy Cooper in Central Park to COVID-19 to George Floyd, people started to recognize this isn't about power and privilege. This is about humanity, right? There's people and people's lives here that matter. And that was represented in the poll that you all just shared, right? There's people that are involved and impacted by how we lead in this space. And that certainly has changed and been amplified, if you will, since the end of May. And in recent months, the reality of systemic oppression is increasing in our awareness. Again, I think COVID-19 was the first thing, right, where you had people who were driving luxury cars showing up at food banks and were embarrassed that they had to show up at a food bank, right? And so they were recognizing, right, there's other people that have to do that. And maybe like there's some humility that I may now have for those people and some empathy that maybe not by choice, but by systemic oppression, like are in that situation. Or recognizing for those of us that were able to shift from in-person to work from home without any problem, we're recognizing that there's some inequities there. Or if we're starting to see the people that were impacted by COVID-19, right, and the healthcare disparities. There's a different awareness around it. And I think that has elevated this conversation to leaders such as yourselves actually wanting to be in this space, getting curious, getting ready to do the work so that you can be ready for these moments when they show up. Things that we heard at the beginning of this was exactly one of the questions that came up. Should we be talking about politics at work, right? Don't all lives matter? You know, why are we using the word whites and white supremacy so often? Like there's a lot of questions and some of those may show up for you as well. Please invite them into the conversation because they're really important for Alex and I in this work to make sure that there's clarity, right? So that you can be powerful with your presence as leaders in this community. And so what we want to do to start this session off is to start by just talking about the dynamics and the language of diversity, equity, inclusion. What many of you probably have been seeing more recently than before was a litany of terminology, like everywhere, right? You might see BIPOC and be like, what does BIPOC mean? Right, and there's a shift in the language. Do I say Angela's Black or do I say she's African American? Like there's all this stuff, all these questions that are showing up, particularly around the vernacular, around diversity, equity, inclusion. So we wanted to answer in this moment, it may shift tomorrow, some of those terms that are important for you to know. The first one's diversity, equity, inclusion. what's the relation, what's the correlation? Diversity, I'll go into more detail here momentarily, but these all play a role with each other, right? Diversity, the unique characteristics that we have. Inclusion is kind of the atmosphere, the environment that we're able to create. And equity is, from my perspective, and as an organization with the Dignitas Agency, this is actually what we prioritize, equity first. And we'll speak to some examples of how that shows up and why that is actually truly important in this moment. So there's 4 areas that Alex and I will talk to you about around the vernacular. We'll start with identity, then we'll speak to oppression, microaggression, and then we'll wrap it up with privilege. So around identity, we want to start off with the dimensions of diversity. So when many hear diversity, and this has happened in quite a few conversations here in the Treasure Valley for me, many people are like, well, we don't have to worry about diversity. Like, we're not diverse. Like, so it doesn't really matter. We're not going to be able to hire diverse pool of candidates. We're not going to be able to do this. There's no diversity. And one of the things that we want to reiterate, and if we leave you with one thing that you know today that you didn't know before, is diversity is not just about race and gender, right? I think here in Idaho, people immediately go to race when they hear diversity, or maybe a little bit after race, they'll go to gender. Diversity is, there's dimensions of it, right? Your primary dimensions are around age, your physical ability, your gender identity, race, ethnicity, those sorts of things. And then it goes out on the continuum to secondary. It can be educational attainment, it can be religion, your geographic location, your working style, right? Are you like a communicator via email or somebody that needs to communicate in person? It could be your language or accent, or, you know, using your hands for gestures, such as you'll probably see from me all day today. And then it goes out into organizational, like, right? Your location, your tenure within the organization, your role within the company, your work experience, your network, right? The tribe that you belong to inside of your organization, and then out to cultural elements, body language, time, traditions and observances, and those sorts of things. All of these are factors of diversity. So when we're looking to be more diverse, when we're looking to invite diversity into the equation, like, here's the dimensions of diversities that you can consider. And what we know, and Deloitte and BCG have talked quite a bit about, is that more diverse teams are more productive and effective and innovative and help the bottom line. Alex?
Yeah, Angela, I think just a point that I like to drive home here too is that one person by default is not a diverse person, right? Because we are all our full selves, and we bring all of these dimensions, both visible and invisible, to who we are as people. And so oftentimes organizations will be like, we need more diverse people. It's like, well, diverse people comes with people that are different across the board. And so we are all part of this diversity. Just some of us get a little bit more of that than others in organizations. And it's important to kind of reflect on who might not be in the room and who is.
Perfect, thanks, Alex. And so we look at the outer layer of that. We talked about culture, right? And so cultural competence is something that really want to underscore for you. There's been an evolution, if you will, over the last few decades. So, you know, 20 years ago or more, right, we focused on IQ, intelligence. And then maybe a decade ago, we started to focus particularly around leaders on EQ, emotional intelligence, like, right, how are our leaders, servant leaders, like, right, how did they connect with their people, not just being doers? And now what we're hearing, a lot of leaders really understand what is invaluable, particularly if you're trying to build an inclusive organization, and therefore build an organization that is most likely more innovative and productive, is CQ, and that's cultural competence. And that's the ability and the skill to be able to relate and work effectively in culturally diverse situations, where you actually not just recognize and acknowledge commonalities, but you actually value difference, right? And you invite differences into the conversation and are able to bridge the gap between the two. So cultural competence, a space that's extremely important in this work that we're doing. We'll quickly go through this and encourage you to go online and just Google the cycle of socialization, and you can read about it. But the cycle of socialization helps us to understand the way in which we are socialized to play certain roles, and how we are affected by issues of oppression, and how we help maintain an oppressive system based upon power. And so if you look at the first in the light blue at the beginning of the cycle represents the situation into which we're born. And we have no control over this. We're typically born without bias, assumptions, or questions. And typically we're either lucky to be born into a privileged situation or unlucky to be born into an underprivileged situation. And then as we continue on the continuum and the first socialization, that process begins immediately upon birth, right? We're either given a pink blanket if we're a girl or a blue blanket if we're a boy, right? Like we're seeing all these gender reveals, like, right? There's no nuance to it at all. And the rules and the norms are already in place, particularly around gender, right? On day one, actually even probably before day one, and we subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, are made more aware of the rewards of conforming, right? And then it continues on. I won't go into more detail, but institutional and cultural socialization. We're socialized by those institutions that we participate in. So in schools, right? In our churches, like by the media, like the things that we're watching on TV, the cartoons that we're watching, or the Disney movies, right? That all is part of our socialization process. And so representation inside of those movies, how important is that, right? For underrepresented groups to see representation of somebody that looks like them when they're trying to figure out who they are and how they can show up. And then it continues on across the cycle. But really important to understand that at each of these steps, right, there's oppression inside of those systems. And typically oppression that we see gets established through dominant culture. And one of the things in the process of socialization is across these five and a few more areas of dominant culture. So when you hear the phrase dominant culture, it's probably shifted. We were using dominant culture a lot prior to May 25th, and Alex, this may be the same for you. And now we're actually saying white supremacy, right? And white supremacy may be really uncomfortable. I was really uncomfortable saying it. Like I grew up here in Idaho, and I had a vision of what that meant, right? And so I had to start to dismantle what that actually means and get some clarity over it and get more comfortable with being able to see it. But dominant culture, what we really mean, and we're talking about the perspectives that get prioritized. There's perspectives that get elevated. And I think that we're very much aware of when we talk about white supremacy, we immediately start to think about the noun, right? Individuals. And what we're talking about is the verb, the action, the activity around it. And so we're looking at the construct that has been elevated in our society. And most of the archetypes are around what's preferred. Or what's valued, and this is where dominant culture is centered around. So it's white supremacy, it's patriarchy or heterosexism, it's capitalism, it's Christian hegemony, it's imperialism. Again, we won't go into great detail about this, but I want you to start to think about dominant culture and how that shows up inside of organizations, and how dominant culture plays out is truly around power. Right? It's the ability to decide who will have access to resources and the capacity to direct or influence the behavior of others, oneself, or or the course of events. So if you're part of dominant culture and you have power inside of that, like, right, you are dictating what is right or wrong. You're dictating policy, right? Which is politics with a lowercase p. And you're dictating those systems in which are oppressive or are inclusive. As we drill down a little bit further, when we look at power, we go into unconscious bias, right? The positions that we hold about others that are influenced by past experiences. And when we look at bias, like we all have bias, right? It's a coping mechanism. We're processing thousands of pieces of information every second. So you have to filter through all of that information. Where bias becomes dangerous, right? Unconscious bias is where power is in the equation, right? And you're biased against certain groups of people because of one of their marginalized characteristics or their intersections. And then we get to oppression, and oppression, you know, basically we covered power right before we covered bias. So if we're talking about dominant culture, power gets assigned to those identities that are dominant, and what happens to that process of socialization is that those dominant perspectives start to be preferred. And we start to stop thinking about the ways that we prioritize them because they become habit, and that's the way unconscious bias shows up. So then inside of that, this is where oppression, right? When you have power and prejudice or preference, this is where, again, marginalized groups start to be oppressed, right? And oppression shows up in a lot of different ways and a lot of different levels. A few of the levels that oppression shows up are at the intra or interpersonal level. So when we're thinking about equity, inclusion, and diversity, many of us think about it at the intra or interpersonal level. Like, you know, I have a friend who's older. I have a friend who's you know, deaf, or I have a friend who's Black, like, right? Like at those levels, that's how we're thinking about diversity. But where oppression really starts to show up and where change truly starts to happen is at the systemic and institutional level, right? It's the organizations, it's the laws and the policies. Those are the things where we can start to see equity show up inside of that conversation. So I see a quick question here. Why do people that are part of the dominant culture often feel attacked or get defensive when topics like privilege come up? Great question. We're going to cover privilege here in a second. But I think that it's been weaponized. Some of this terminology has been weaponized, and there's a lack of understanding into actually what the words or the terms mean, right? And sometimes we conflate what people are using them for and what they actually mean. And that's why Alex and I want to walk through these definitions with you so you actually have clarity over what the terms actually mean. And sometimes I think that takes a little bit of the hit off of it, if you will. But I think that sometimes when we hear terms like white privilege or dominant culture or white supremacists, white supremacy, people feel like it's a personal attack and they start to feel judged and feel guilty. And there's all of that conflagration of all those things that triggers them not being able to actually listen and sense into what's going on, and they stop.
I'll also add to that, Angela, I think that to some extent, a lot of people haven't had to have these conversations. They don't have practice. They don't know how it feels to be kind of drawn into that conversation unwillingly in some ways. And it's because as a white person, especially growing up in Idaho, there was most of my life, I didn't have to opt into these conversations. I really didn't. I could just go through life and not have to engage because it didn't affect me on my day-to-day basis in life in the same ways it affected others. And so I think it's some of that is, you know, my partner who's Black, she's been talking about this from day one. Like as soon as she could talk, she knew of the kind of society that she was entering. And I probably didn't have this conversation really going into like high school or college, right? And so I think there's also some of that going on as well. And then Angela, I also saw a question come in around capitalism in terms of kind of, was it created to intentionally oppress others, or was it something that was created and the outcome wasn't unintentional? I think with any system, especially capitalism, I mean, we're going to get into this a little bit about dominant culture and then also whiteness and kind of what comes from that, which is really closely intertwined with capitalism in many ways. And so we will get to that a little bit more, but Angela, do you want to add anything on that before we?
Yeah, so much of this, like, right, is a social construct, right? And so, Marissa, I think that's a great question. And for all of you, I encourage you, there's 2 videos that you should look up. One is, it's like a 7-minute video by Kimberly Jones, who's an activist who, again, right on the heels of George Floyd, came out with a video, an impassioned plea about Monopoly, the game of Monopoly, which kind of describes capitalism. And then there's a professor by the name of Alan Johnson, Allan, and he has a longer video. It's about 27 minutes about the game of Monopoly. And he talks about, again, white supremacy is a social construct. And in that system, how the game is played around capitalism is for very few to win, right? And most to lose, right? And inside of that, the effort is around pitting middle-class white people against marginalized groups. And so if you keep them fighting against each other and thinking that it's a zero-sum game that they're taking away from one another, the capitalists at the top of the ecosystem with the privilege and the power that are setting policy, right? You're distracted from what's actually happening at the top of a dominant culture, white supremacy sort of social construct. So if you do get a chance to watch those 2 videos, really fascinating way to simplify the nuance that is going on and to actually name the names and to use the terminology. I'll turn it over to Alex for.
Definitely. Yeah. So part of that, what informs that is racism. And I think that's one of those weighted terms that when people use it, we kind of are like, whoa, I'm not a racist, not me. But I think because it's such a weighted term, it actually, people deflect more when they hear it. And people don't want to be a part of that without engaging in what racism is. So it's really the belief that a particular race is superior or inferior to another. And that the social moral traits are predetermined by his or her or theirs inborn biological characteristics. So just based on who you are or how you look in a certain space, you're either going to benefit or not. Angela talked about who wins and who doesn't in and out group. You can't really kind of be in the middle of that. You're either at the margins or in power. And that can actually shift depending on the environment you're in. You can be in one environment and feel some privileges, and then you move into a different environment and those privileges feel immediately stripped. So if we can move to the next slide here too. So part of that is really whiteness. And so whiteness is really just the way that people in their cultures and customs and beliefs operate by the standard of other groups to which they are compared. So whiteness does not inherently mean white people. It's a concept in itself that our society was built to really work for few and not necessarily all. So dating back to, slavery, and you see Jim Crow and the remains of that system today that still exists very much. It was always made for certain people. All the policies we have today, it's made by a few at the top, and many of those few at the top are white. And so whiteness, I like to give a few examples of, one is just model minority. I don't know if anyone's heard the term model minority, typically used with, especially in the workplace, for Asian employees. And this was actually used because they wanted to bring some people, some minorities were okay, their proximity to whiteness or what their ideal minority was, and separate further the other minorities in society. And so that even created further divide for the out group. You then bring some people to the top of that out group and some people push down even further, such as Black, women, men, and non-binary individuals, right? And so your proximity or really kind of how quickly you compare to a white informed, basically a white informed system, you're going to be better off. The other thing I like to point out is until very recently, and probably in the last 5 years, you used to be able to Google beauty, right? And when you Googled beauty, the people that showed up are mostly white people, kind of European standards of what beauty should look like. And if you Googled mugshots, it was mostly people of color that showed up, and Google looked at them, they're like, whoa, something's going on. And it wasn't necessarily because like, oh, that's what's the honest reality out there. It's really because the system was built with bias in mind by white people behind that. And so that's what was informed to us. So even the media that we think is just showing kind of the truth and the reality, it's been informed by whiteness. And so that is just in every kind of aspect of what we see and what we experience in our day-to-day life. That also then correlates to the white dominant culture that Angela was speaking of, which grants advantages to some people, non-advantages to other. So people identify as white rarely have to think about their racial identity because they live in a culture where whiteness has been normalized. So as a white person in the workplace, that's why when I go back to that concept of like, no one's a diverse person, it's because white people are like, oh, there's us, and then there's everyone else. I know there's someone in a comment here that said, you're the other category, right? There's so many people that fit into that other category when white people like myself are speaking about diversity. Like white is almost like the default. So I'll bring in a couple examples here. One is I'm left-handed, and so I have left-handed scissors, which are a thing. And it's funny, my partner was trying to use them the other day. She's like, I hate your scissors. I just hate these scissors. They never work for me. They never work my hand. I'm like, well, that's me with every other scissor. Like I finally got one for myself that works and it feels like I can actually cut things. But most of the time people don't even think about that. Like I'm sure those of you that are right-handed, you probably are just like, no, they're just scissors. I didn't think about the fact that they were made for people like me and they work for people like me and not necessarily for others. Another example I like to think about in terms of race specifically, and it's very small, but you can see how it kind of correlates to the broader picture, is Band-Aids. Band-Aids for me, you put one on, rub around my finger, you can barely tell. It just goes with my skin tone, right? But for a lot of people, that's not the case. And you actually have to go get specific Band-Aids to match your skin tone. And Band-Aid right now calls that color nude, but it's not nude for everyone, right? And so it's small things like that that you can see that we're informed by this kind of basically white dominant society that then feeds into every little detail about how things are created around us. So that feeds into, again, white supremacy. And it's a loaded term, we get it. But it's really the idea that white people and ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. So it's that superiority where it's the default, we're better, everybody should match and align with us. And we just know that that's not going to be very successful.
And I love your examples too. There's so many good examples. Another place where this shows up is in AI, right? Or facial recognition. So in AI, like, we all go to airports or to different places where we're in the restrooms washing our hands and we just whisk our hand underneath the sensor and the water starts. Well, if you have a darker complexion, the water doesn't start for you because the sensors are programmed to pick up light. Right. So there's so often I'm in an airport trying to get the water to go and it will not go. Right. And so I might have to find a light object to trigger that sensor because the designers who were designing were most likely white. Right. And so when you don't have diversity in a room and you're not able to notice those things that show up, that's how the outcomes can happen. So that's why it's important that we have an awareness around how whiteness and white dominant culture and standards show up inside of the workplace.
Yeah, and I would say that whiteness, much like racism, you kind of either uphold it or you're actively dismantling it. I don't think there's really kind of an in-between there, and we'll get into a little bit about anti-racism here in a bit. But here's some characteristics of what we mean with white dominant culture. And some of these you might not even inherently make that tie. You might just say, oh, I'm just a perfectionist. But what informed that and kind of what informs how we have to show up to our jobs, our communities, with our families, it's really dominated by this culture. So you see perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness. I know there's a question in the chat around that. Quantity over quality, either or thinking, individualism. So a few that I want to point out here. One is defensiveness and kind of right to comfort. Like I said earlier, it's like white people don't necessarily have to always engage in these conversations. They don't always have to opt in until sometimes they're just forced to opt in. And I think with some of that, there's a right to comfort. Like we have the right to go about our lives and not have to talk about these things. We very much get opt out and I don't want to talk about race today. I don't want to talk about politics today. I don't want to go there. But not everyone gets that luxury, right? People have to move through this world and they have to really zero in on how their identity actually informs their experience, how it informs their kids' experience, and so forth. And so that right to comfort piece, I can't, that's the biggest one for me. I'm like, I want to get uncomfortable because you can't grow in comfort, right? The last one I'll touch on, and then I'll hand it over to Angela to touch on a few too. Individualism. This one is really big for me too, because when we think about people of color, let's say Barack Obama, right? We find those kind of standout talents, say well, if he could do it, everyone can do it. And I'm like, but we don't do that with white people. We're not like, oh, if this person can do it, everyone can do it. We don't have to go find those particular kind of standout people that have made it to make the case that there's equity. But we can name by name cherry pick the people of color to show that across the board everything's fine. And so I think there's an individual where white people like to feel like they're individuals, they're not part of a racial category, but they very much are. And that racial category is white, just like everybody else has a racial category. The minute you feel like you can opt out of race is the minute you feel like you can opt out of your role in society and the inequities it has. Yeah, Angela.
Yes, great. And Lindsay has a great question. Can you explain how perfectionism is white dominant? And are there not people of other cultures who strive for perfection? One of the things that we see inside of this is right, because we are so used to dominant culture that we think anything aside of that is outside the norm. And so what's interesting when you look at all these qualities and many of the ones that Alex pointed out and explained is oftentimes we conflate these with leadership, right? We look at the leadership development space and we look at perfectionism, sense of urgency, getting things done, right? Quantity over quality, the fear of open conflict, like all these things that we feel like this is actually how, you know, leaders work. This is how leaders lead. That's a construct that we've been taught and socialized over time to believe. And so I'll use an example of being on time or time. I was just in a conversation with actually Jimmy Halliburton earlier today from Boise Bicycle Project. And he was talking about, like, several years ago, they had some clients from Bhutan, some refugees that were here from Bhutan, and they had some appointments with them, and they were always late. They never showed up on time. And so he and his team started to get a little bit agitated, like, okay, like the disrespect inside of that. And they finally did some research, had a conversation, and recognized in Bhutan, like, time doesn't matter. Time for them is like, if you say you're going to come over whenever. It could be today, tomorrow, next week, like, right? It doesn't matter, in the same way that we've constructed time to be about respect and to have that same sort of meaning here in a white dominant culture here in society. And we can notice that because time means something different in Germany than it does in France, than it does in Jamaica, than it does in the US. So, right, it is a social construct inside of a dominant culture society, right? And so we conflate these. And so notice when you start conflating success or leadership or excellence around certain terms, and if those truly actually do matter, right? Because if you look inside of some organizations like the Amazons or the Nikes, who've created a culture where everyone has an opinion because they're trying to be as creative and innovative as possible, some of these things don't show up. Right? There's team building, right? It's not, there's paternalism doesn't show up the same way. There's no power hoarding, right? Perfectionism, they're willing to make mistakes, because if you are willing to make mistakes, you can be much more creative. So it's a construct, and again, notice where you start to get uncomfortable saying, like, this is the norm, this is the way it is, that's the standard, that's the way to get to be great at what you do. Or is that actually something that we've constructed and said? And we're starting to see it now in the work from home. Like, 4 months ago, like, productive employees were employees that showed up early and left late, right? And worked in the office. And now we've seen employees be extremely productive at home, maybe even more efficient, particularly for the introverts, right? Who are more efficient and productive at home. And the construct is that you go to the office to get things done.
Yeah, and Angela, there's a comment here too about comfort also extends to calling someone in about their words or action. And I love that who brought the Sue, that you brought that forward, because I think that one's a big one as well, in terms of someone kind of holding you accountable and you feeling shame is not the same as you being shamed. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that for that, it's up to the receiver to hear the message and then respond accordingly. It's not, the onus is not on the person calling attention to why something was harmful or what was said or done. And so I really love that point about kind of understanding that difference.
Yeah, and I always use the example, like, intent and impact are two different things. Like, right, so the intention can be, you know, the right thing, like, right, but the impact is what really matters in the situation. If you're willing to understand the impact that you had on somebody, regardless of what your intention was, that's where you can bridge the gap. So the example I use is, I didn't intend to step on Melissa's toe, but I broke her toe, like, right? And so the impact, her toe hurts, she's in pain. And if I were to say, like, well, I didn't mean to step on your toe, why are you, like, crying? Like, right, like, that's what shows up in these sorts of situations. All right, privilege. Alex, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, definitely. So privilege, if we go to the next slide, so there we go. Rights, benefits, advantages enjoyed by a person or body people beyond the advantages experienced by other individuals. And so a lot of times with privilege, it's tied to socioeconomic status. And so a lot of people are like, well, I worked hard for where I got to in life. Like, I didn't have it easy. I was poor growing up, all these different variations of what privilege means. And the thing is, like, we all can have privilege in many different ways. It could be about the color of our skin. It can be heteronormative privilege. It can be gender lines. It could be, you name it, we all have some kind of privilege. The one thing I do like to point out, though, especially in conversations about race, is that privilege, in some scenarios, you can have a great deal of privilege, in other ones, you don't. And so I loved the example that my friend Allison shares in this work. And she speaks about how the fact that in some circles, she has great privilege. She's very well off socioeconomically. She's a cisgender woman, and she feels very confident about that and feels like she benefits from that. The minute she goes into a really fancy store in the mall, that privilege is gone. Her hands are out of her pockets. She's being followed, she's being watched, and it's immediately shifted. Any privileges that she had walking to that store are removed the minute she's in the store because of the color of her skin as a Black woman. And so I love the idea that everyone can have privilege, but I think it's important to also recognize that some people have it more than others. And then some people, even if they have it, can have it stripped away. And so I think when we break down privilege in this way, it helps people really kind of come to the conversation, actually talk through it in ways that they might have not otherwise known because they had such a narrow concept of what privilege means, which is just one element of the very broad definition that we typically speak of.
Yeah, and to tag onto that, like the so what around this is, if we really do care about being inclusive leaders and creating equitable environments, if we understand that it's not just enough to operate at the interpersonal and the intrapersonal level, but we have to use that privilege to interrupt and disrupt at the systemic and the institutional levels. So that's really the power and the important thing about privilege that we want to help you understand is that, like, right, so I'm privileged. Stacey and I talk about it all the time inside of our engagements with clients is like, I know the fact that I went to Stanford University and played women's basketball, right, gets me into conversations in a different way than if I didn't have those things on my resume. And it allows me to have conversation and proximity to CEOs that are now willing to listen to me because they're like, wait a minute, my son goes to Stanford or my kid plays basketball, like, right? So privilege does matter. It doesn't mean it's unearned, but it's nothing that we should be afraid of, right? I think that, again, unfortunately, some of these terms have been weaponized so much so that we fear what they are about. And Alex profoundly pointed out, like, it's something completely different than what the perception may be around them. And so as we look at some of these terms, like, right, so as we want to be inclusive leaders, the only way to undo racism or oppression, what we speak to quite a bit here in Boise, it's not just about racism, right? We're using that lens because the proximity to George Floyd and racism is on everyone's mind. But the only way to undo racism or oppression is to consistently identify and describe it, then to dismantle it, right? So we have to be in conversation. We have to be willing to be honest and candid and vulnerable in these spaces. And so what does that look like, being anti-racist, Alex?
Yeah, I like what you said about it's really kind of upholding it or disrupting it. I think that's through with all of these concepts we're talking about. So it's really that conscious focus, sustained effort to change a system or policy and practice procedure that has racist effects. And so, you know, Dr. Kennedy, he kind of talks about the fact that you're either racist or anti-racism, like anti-racist. So where do you fall on that spectrum? And I think at times, there are times where each one of us are racist. Like, it's being built into that. When you think about the cycle of oppression, we are born into society. I've heard example once where with like climate change and environmental changes, it's not your fault that the world is necessarily where it is, but does that mean you're just not going to recycle? You're just going to be like, like I didn't cause the problem, so I'm not going to help to fix it. No, we were all born into the society, and it's our job to either uphold it, which I hope that we aren't going to opt into, or disrupt it.
Awesome. Well, I know we're getting close to the hour, so if you need to head out, please feel free to. We'll probably wrap up in a couple more terms to bring up. An example that has really helped me around anti-racism is like if you're in the airport. I use a lot of airport analogies, Alex. If you're in an airport and you're on the moving sidewalk, right? If you're running, being a racist or racism is actually running on that moving sidewalk, right? Like it's like you were in a hurry to get there. Many think that, like, right, the passive approach, if I just stand on the moving sidewalk, like I'm not running towards it, like, right, like I'm just getting from point A to B. Well, being neutral in this moment, right, of not acting in this moment is actually an action. You are still moving toward racism. Like if you want to be an anti-racist, like you actually need to be sprinting in the opposite direction, right? And so anti-racism, the two key words there in this definition, active and conscious, right? You are actively engaged in disrupting those systems. Truly important.
Yeah, Angela, on that note, I think just like silence is a statement, like you were saying, kind of like that. If you are silent, it speaks so much volume, and it's actually deafening in this moment for leaders that don't say anything. You come to work and if it's really affecting you and you come to work and no one's talking about it, that by itself can feel completely just disarming.
Yes. And last thing we want to cover today is the difference between equality and equity, right? We get a lot of these questions all the time, and I'll actually use this graphic to indicate it's probably the best way to see it. So inequality, right, is the unequal access to opportunities. As you can see, like on both sides of the tree, like, right, that the apples are falling out more plentiful on one side of the tree. Equality, right, is that both of those individuals have the same size ladder to be able to try to access the tree. But unfortunately, you see with the individual on the right, right, because the tree isn't growing toward the sun, like, right, is still at a deficit. Equity is when there's custom tools that are utilized to actually address the inequity, right? So now the person on the right, like their ladder is a little bit higher, so they can now access the tree. And then justice is actually the fact that we start to use some tools to fix the system and to straighten the tree up so that they both have the same access, right, to the apples. And what this shows up as currently in society, like, if I suggest you all, if you get a chance, to just Google the Baltimore Museum of Art, and they've been going through a really interesting journey around equity. So many people are talking about equality in this moment. And what we know as leaders is equality is not going to help us close the gap, right? Because if we continue, like if we're looking at the gender pay gap, if we continue to provide promotions or pay raises to men and women at the same rate, that gap is going to stay the same. So we have to factor in equity. And what the Baltimore Museum of Art is doing is they recognize that only 2% of their art collection is from female artists. And so if they want to have equality, they knew that they can't just, purchase the same amount of art from men and women. They actually needed to make a commitment to purchase more art for women. So they made a commitment in 2020. They were only going to purchase art from women, right? And there's been a lot of there's a lot of people attacking. A lot of the male artists are upset. They're having to sell, in order to make room for those new pieces of art, they have to sell the men's pieces, right? Some people are saying they're out of compliance, but what they did was they knew what the risk was going to be. Their lawyers are prepared for it. They're prepared to go to battle and to go to court, right? Because they know that this is important enough. If they truly want to have a space that's inclusive of everybody and that has different perspectives for men and women, or those that identify as men and women, that they were going to have to focus on equity for a period of time to then be able to get to equality moving forward.
Yeah, and Angela, a quick note that I wanted to also add to that is that equity, everybody gets caught up on fairness. Everyone wants it to be fair, but equity is a means to achieve fairness. You all are you all go out to dinner, or maybe not now, but you did at one point go out to dinner with friends maybe. And if you all got something different, let's say someone got a steak, someone got a salad, what's fair is probably to split it. So the person that got steak paid more of the bill. In their share of the bill, whereas equality would be everybody just splits it evenly. And I think some of us know, if someone got 5 drinks and a steak and I got a salad, I don't necessarily want to be just splitting that bill in half. And so you all practice equity daily without knowing it, but now let's actually put this into place for the workplace as well, in our communities.
And one of the tools, we looked at the tree where they had the, the boards helping to straighten the tree out. One of the tools that have helped us in those situations has been Venmo. Is so huge, right? You can split the bill up perfectly. You don't have to worry about someone paying for somebody else's drinks in that matter. But I know we're at a little bit after 1. We want to open up some space for any questions that you may have around terminology, or ask us anything around diversity, equity, inclusion. And there's been some great questions, so thank you all for posting some thoughts inside of the chat box.
So silent.
I know. There's a lot of information in silence. Sue, it looks like you have a question.
I do. I wondered with this issue about diversity and equity, how do you get in your environment from stupid to informed, with these definitions and things that you have? Because I work with folks that they have good hearts, but they don't even get it when I try and tell them.
Yeah, change can be difficult, right? Of closing that gap. And what we like if you have a relationship and you can be in conversation with somebody where they don't feel like they're being attacked, Right, that's so important. And this work is really around not trying to change somebody's mind, but to open their perspective, right? So that they're open-minded and they can actually receive this information, process the information, and then maybe they'll start to move off of their position and maybe have a stance versus a position, and move closer to being informed. And so that's the effort. It takes relationships and not trying to be right inside of those relationships. Sometimes we get incredibly frustrated, and if you're not patient with it, like, right, it's not moving quick enough. But I think right now, because of the polarization, like, right, the Pew Research from a couple of years ago around the polarization around politics, people are actually using this as a political issue, which makes us all afraid, because we don't talk about politics, religion, or race and those sorts of things at the table, if you will. And so just being able to navigate it, I think that the things that have worked for me is being willing to be in conversation and to listen. Like, so what do you mean by that? Like, right, so tell me more about how you got to that decision. And one thing in this particular moment, we hear it with a lot of leaders. They're like, our company is about, we want to be the best design firm, design the best experiences. And we're like, so do you mean the best experiences for white men or for everybody? Right. And I think sometimes when we talk about humanity, sometimes when they're like opposed to diversity, equity, inclusion, if you simply say, well, are you just interested in doing this for just a certain group of people, or are you interested in actually doing that broadly? And then they can actually realize that humanity may not be in play with how they're leading their lives and their efforts. Alex,
No, I agree. And I think being clear about, like you said, are you there to change your mind or open their perspective? I think knowing that up front, knowing what a successful conversation looks like, and then expressing that up front, saying, hey, here's what I would like to have from this conversation. Are you also willing to help me get to that goal for you as well? And just stating that up front can actually have people kind of take a step back and be like, if this is the goal, to create understanding, not for you to attack me or vice versa. No judgments here. We're just trying to get that understanding. People are much more likely to kind of lean in and have that conversation in a way that doesn't feel like it's a debate. Because I think a lot of people don't even, they challenge people, and they feel like that's a debate. It's like, you can challenge each other and grow together and still meet that common goal at the end in a respectful way as well.
And the other thing, Sue, is data helps. One thing that I love as a resource here in Idaho is maybe a year or so ago, Dr. Joe Gill from Boise State did the fettuccine forum around civil rights in Idaho. And it was enlightening to me. I don't know if I didn't understand the situation here, and Mayor McLean actually alluded to it in her State of the City address last week or 2 weeks ago, and the systemic and institutional racism that's taken place in the state around housing discrimination or redlining and a lot of different things. Is to actually know what has happened, right? I think some people don't know the history, and so or are afraid of the history. But if you can point to, here's why there are certain people that are oppressed, it's because there were actually laws on the books where people could not be hired if you were Black, like, right? Like, I always wondered growing up here in Idaho, like, why aren't there more Black people here? Like, we used to be the most populous, Lewiston used to be the most populous city in the Northwest, more populous than Seattle and Portland, right? But then all of a sudden, Portland, Seattle, Salt Lake, Denver, like, those cities have more people of color. And I always was curious why that happened. Well, there's no wonder, like, right, if there's laws on the book that made it illegal to either work here if you're Black or to hire somebody, then it shouldn't be surprised that we don't have more diversity here. Jasmine, it looks like you have a question.
I do. Well, I guess kind of leading into it, I think one of the notes I wrote down when I was listening to what you're saying, and I was just like, I feel like this should be obvious, but I also feel like a lot of people miss this, is that people of color are not monolithic. And a lot of people make that assumption, and I feel like in my organizations, it's really presenting a challenge because they are starting to do this whole diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. And, they asked me to be a part of it. And I constantly have to remind people, like, I cannot speak for all people of color. And it's a source of frustration. And then I guess one of my main question and why I raised my hand is, I find this work incredibly exhausting, which, because people like to go to people of color and ask them to essentially do the work for them for free, which I think is problematic in a sense in itself. And then also, I feel like the bigger thing is people view it as self-serving. And yes, in a way, it is self-serving, but I think it's also an incredible risk for someone who's a person of color in a workplace to bring up these things, because that could potentially be your job is on the line or you're not supported. So it's how do you, one, combat the exhaustion from it, but also want to help move it forward, and two, get people to see that it's not self-serving in the sense that, hey, I'm doing this because I want to get ahead of you or have some, I don't know if that makes sense, but like that I'm doing it to really just promote myself in the organization to get ahead or get promoted versus, hey, I'm tired of being treated this way.
Yeah, no, brilliant question. And thank you for that, Arc. Because you just outlined like all of the reason why there's so much nuance to this, and it's complex, right? So on the front end, I would say as a person of color, there's trauma that people are experiencing, right, in these moments. And every time we see a video on TV, or every time someone says something to you, or microaggression or whatever, right, trauma happens. Like there's a great book by Resma, I can't pronounce the last name, called My Grandmother's Hands. And it talks about racialized trauma, which could be across any lines, like, right, and how real it is. And so how often those in marginalized communities, because dominant culture, you have to show up and deliver, how often you step over, like, right, what the trauma, and the trauma doesn't go anywhere, right? But you have to step over. So on a Monday morning, something can happen over the weekend. On Monday morning, you have to show up at work with a smile on your face, ready to deliver. And how important it is actually for you to heal, right? There's a difference between a healing space and a change space. And part of the healing process is a somatic process, is actually being able to account for whatever's going on with you. And so I encourage you, like, that exhaustion is real. Don't deny it. Don't run from it. Don't be ashamed of it. Don't think that it's, like, I got to push on. Like, acknowledge the exhaustion and figure out how self-care plays a role in your process, in your day-to-day, so that you can build up the will and the grit to do the work when you so choose to do it. All right, so that's somatic. Don't step over your feelings, acknowledge, and this is for everyone. This is like, dominant culture and marginalized group is in this space in particular. Notice what is going on for you. Like, there's a lot of information inside of that. And then the second piece, what I've learned and started to own a little bit more, and it really was, this was a difficult few months for me. Like, I think we had the, Ahmaud Arbery, and then it was COVID. And then it was, Amy Cooper. Amy Cooper was tough for me, because what Amy Cooper did in Central Park was she validated what we've been saying, was that the police are used as a weapon against Black people. And she knew exactly what she was doing when she called the police, but not just did she call the police, but she escalated and changed the tone of her voice, because she knew what that could create, right? And that's been going on for years. That was Emmett Till, like, right, was falsely accused of whistling at somebody. It was the Tulsa race riots, like, right, where another woman, like, falsely accused somebody and they were lynched or killed, or, or the city was bombed and destroyed. And so, like, that to me, like, was like this visceral experience of, like, there it was in plain daylight of what we've been saying for forever, right? Is that the reason why 8-year-old kids that are shooting hoops in their driveways hide behind their cars when the cops drive by is exactly what just happened there on the screen, right? And then we had George Floyd, and then it was Rashad Brooks, like, right? And then it was Jacob Blake. And it's like on camera, like, we're having this conversation right now in this moment, and there's cameras everywhere. And how many places are there not cameras? Like, right, and we had Breonna Taylor, like, right, who's at home, and all of this stuff is a lot. And I had to make a decision, because I got a lot of, people, friends that were reaching out, like, hey, what can I do? I don't know what to do. Like, what should, how can I help? And I was like in this moment, like, check in with me for a second, right? And if there was a problem with your child, like, you would get online and figure out how to help your child, like, right? Like, how to do these things, how to bridge the gap. And I had to make a decision, was that growing up here in Idaho, 99% of the time, I prioritized others' needs over my own, like, right? So in these moments where they needed clarity or someone to guide them or give them insight, like I was like I'm the only Black person that they may know or interact with. I have to be there for them, right? Even in places where that was traumatic to me, where I just needed to do some self-care. And in this moment, right around May with the George Floyd, I made a decision that I wasn't just going to default to prioritizing. I was going to default to prioritizing what I needed in that moment, right? And so sometimes, like, right, like this is who I am. I want to help and I want to be of service and I want to inform. And there's sometimes that just in that moment, I'm exhausted, I'm frustrated, and it's not going to be the best thing for me. And so making that decision, being able to like step into your power and that you have a choice in that matter is the second piece that you can do. And then, you know, inside of work is deciding like how much change you think can happen inside of work, and finding those allies or accomplices that are willing to help you lift the load. So you're not lifting this boulder uphill, but that others are helping you as well and using leverage.
Yeah, Angela, I think, oh, Jasmine, I saw you just came off mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm like very quick with the Zoom. And I guess thinking in the second part, and thinking about the exhaustion piece, and I think my question more, I should have just went straight to the point with this, because you answered my question great, but the reason I'm asking is because of a certain situation, and that is like where I work, we have a small group right now that we're trying to do some diversity work. It's myself, another person of color, and our big boss. And she reached out to community partners to help kind of educate and kind of point us in the right direction, just so that it doesn't fall on two people of color in our entire organization to take the load, because it is exhausting. And we were told that we're not committed. And I think that was the most frustrating part, to hear from other people who are also people of color, to tell us that we're not committed to the work. And so I guess, how do you deal with that when it comes from, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's finding the balance between being committed and like also, you know, we only have so much capacity